George Lyon, Liberal Democrats MEP for Scotland. Let's just go back to the original proposal first of all. What is this proposal from the European Commission on GMOs?
It basically proposes to give the powers to decide whether you ban GM cultivation of crops back to member states. And it allows member states to make up their mind on whether they allow farmers to grow it. They've set two conditions. One is it cannot be on scientific and environmental grounds, and secondly it must comply with all the treaties. So I'm not sure exactly what that leaves, but it certainly has political grounds, I think, that's going to be used to introduce bans.
So, I mean, is that what you're really worried about in these proposals, that it's going to be the political concerns that are going to rule, really, when it comes to these decisions?
Yeah, I believe that on issues of food safety, all decisions have to be based on good scientific advice and evidence. If you move away from the bedrock of scientific advice and the rock that provides in your decision making, then you set the precedent of doing what is popular rather than what is actually what the actual science guarantees is right. So I am deeply concerned that by introducing this new proposal, that we end up in a situation where it's decisions on the popularity of the proposal rather than whether the food is safe that takes precedent, and that's the slippery slope, I believe, to chaos and try to reassure consumers about what's safe and what's not.
I mean, are you worried that, in fact, the public opinion in the UK is not in favour of these crops? I mean, is that the perception that you have, and you fear that that might lead to negative decisions on the part of the government?
I'm not sure where the consumer lies on this one, because one of the problems we have in this whole debate is that there are genuine consumer fears, as there is about any new technology. What politicians should be doing is responsibly trying to respond to them and explain what's going on. Too many politicians fall into the trap, though, of stoking that fire for their own political ends, and therefore it's difficult to know whether consumers are genuinely concerned about it or whether their fears are just been inflamed by some of the political rhetoric that's around this sensitive subject. I believe that if you actually explain to consumers what it's about, you explain that the rest of the world is eating this, and indeed every time they travel to the United States, Brazil, any other country outside Europe, you are eating food that comes from GM technology. And indeed a lot of the medicines they use are actually brought about because of the use of biotechnology. That then they would maybe get some perspective and some context, and I actually think they would probably support the introduction of it, provided it was labelled and they could have the choice.
I mean, do you feel that farmers in the UK and in Scotland, your constituency, do you feel that they're losing out, if you like, at the moment? Would you like to see them get more access to grow GM crops?
I don't think they're losing out at the moment, because the current crop of GM crops that are around, I don't think provide any great economic benefit. But in terms of solving this great challenge we have of a more sustainable agriculture, we're going to need that new technology to help solve these problems, to be able to develop crops that don't need artificial fertiliser, that don't need constant spraying with herbicides, crops that will grow with less water and drought-resistant conditions, because the impact of climate change is going to make all of these things a necessity in the future, and therefore to develop a sustainable food system, I believe that these new tools are going to be needed in the future. So it's the future I'm really worried about rather than the present, and if you set a precedent where these new technologies are banned because it's popular rather than because there's any food safety issue, then that's a dangerous road to go down.
The European Commission has, I think it's fair to say, traditionally taken a hard line on GM crops. To what extent do you think this was an attempt by them to sort of soften and relax things that perhaps isn't going or won't go as they intended?
Well, I think one of the worries is that this is an attempt to pass the political buck from Europe back to member states. I think the Commission is utterly frustrated with the current deadlock in Council, where agricultural ministers and environmental ministers hide behind the Commission and keep blocking the authorisation process for new GM crops to be agreed in Europe. So I think the suspicion I have is this is an attempt to pass the buck back and say to member states, here you are, you've got this decision now, you can face up to your consumers and voters and stop blaming us for all the mess that we're in.
So your role now is to draft the response to these proposals on behalf of the Agriculture Committee here in the European Parliament. How are you going to try and address your concerns?
Well, I am still asking a whole series of questions about how this might work, about the precedents it sets, about what happens to the single market if we go down this route. Does it still work, or do we end up with 27 different versions of what GM-free is? So I'm going to try and draft a report that will seek to address some of these issues. I'll do it in conjunction with my colleagues in Environment who lead in this, but right now I am pretty unconvinced about the merits of this proposal.